Look at any promotional material for Dubai, and you will inevitably see it. The Palm Jumeirah. It is a masterpiece of modern engineering. A man-made island visible from space, built from 94 million cubic meters of sand, costing an estimated $12 billion. It represents the absolute pinnacle of luxury real estate, where billionaires, celebrities, and global elite purchase sprawling villas with private beaches. The promise is simple: endless sunshine, infinite wealth, and a pristine ocean right at your doorstep. But if you look past the polished marketing brochures and fly over the waters of the Palm today, you might notice something the developers try very hard to ignore. The water is changing. Beneath the surface of this multi-billion-dollar paradise, a silent, invisible crisis is unfolding. It is not an invasion, and it is not a natural disaster. It is a slow, methodical suffocation caused by the exact same machine that keeps this desert city alive. To understand why the ecosystem surrounding one of the most expensive real estate projects on Earth is fundamentally struggling to breathe, we have to look away from the glittering skyline. We have to dive into the dark, heavy, and toxic physics of hyper-saline wastewater. The problem hiding beneath the balconies of the ultra-rich is not just an environmental glitch. It is a terrifying lesson in thermodynamics, and the bill for this ecological debt is finally coming due. The story of the Palm Jumeirah is often told as a triumph over nature. The creators looked at a shallow, featureless coastline and decided to draw a palm tree on the ocean floor. They dredged sand from the bottom of the Persian Gulf, sprayed it into precise geometric patterns, and secured it with millions of tons of rock. When it was finished, it added nearly 50 miles of new coastline to Dubai. The financial logic was brilliant. Real estate developers essentially printed highly valuable waterfront land out of thin air. For a while, it seemed like the perfect economic engine. Wealthy investors flocked to the fronds of the palm, building mansions and boutique hotels. The surface looked exactly like the rendering. But natural ecosystems do not care about real estate valuations or architectural awards. They care about flow, oxygen, and chemical balance. And very quickly, the perfect geometry of the palm began to conflict with the chaotic reality of ocean dynamics. If you step off the private beaches today and venture beneath the waves, the vibrant blue water gives way to something else entirely. Divers and marine biologists have noted areas where the ocean floor feels lifeless. A strange, cloudy layer sits quietly at the bottom. Corals struggle to establish themselves. Fish populations in certain stagnant pockets are eerily thin. The water in these inner fronds is not the crystal-clear paradise promised in the advertisements. It is something much darker, much heavier, and significantly more dangerous to organic life. This is not simply pollution in the traditional sense. You will not find massive oil spills or floating garbage patches causing this specific decay. What is killing the ecosystem of the Palm Jumeirah is something far more fundamental to the survival of Dubai itself. It is a byproduct of human desperation in a desert environment. The glittering towers, the sprawling malls, the golf courses, and the thousands of swimming pools all require millions of gallons of fresh water every single day. But Dubai has no rivers. It has no deep aquifers. It has virtually no rain. To survive, the city must manufacture its own water. And the waste product of that survival is systematically being dumped directly back into the surrounding sea, creating a localized environmental nightmare that money cannot easily wash away. To comprehend the scale of the problem, we must first understand the lifeblood of Dubai. The city survives almost entirely on desalination, specifically a process called reverse osmosis. It is a miracle of industrial engineering. Massive intake pipes suck in millions of gallons of seawater from the Persian Gulf. This water is then pushed at incredibly high pressure through a series of microscopic membranes. The pressure forces the pure water molecules through the filter, leaving the salt, minerals, and impurities behind. The fresh water goes into the municipal grid to water the lawns and fill the bathtubs of the Palm Jumeirah. But the laws of chemistry dictate that matter cannot be destroyed. All the salt that was stripped from the fresh water has to go somewhere. The result is a substance known as brine. This is not just slightly salty water. This is an ultra-concentrated, super-heavy industrial sludge. The mathematics of survival in Dubai are brutally inefficient. For every single liter of fresh water produced by a desalination plant, the facility generates roughly 1.5 liters of toxic brine. Let that ratio sink in. The city creates more liquid waste than it does usable water. Every single day, massive desalination plants across the region churn out immense volumes of this hyper-saline liquid. And because pumping it far out into the deep ocean is considered too expensive, the vast majority of this brine is discharged directly back into the shallow coastal waters. The pipes vomit this heavy liquid out continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In a normal, open ocean environment, with deep trenches and powerful global currents, this brine might eventually dilute and dissipate. But the Persian Gulf is not the open ocean. It is one of the shallowest, warmest, and most enclosed bodies of water on the planet, and the waters surrounding the artificial islands of Dubai are shallower still. When this super-concentrated sludge hits the coastal waters, it does not mix gently. It acts like an invasive force. The people, watering their manicured lawns on the fronds of the palm, are entirely unaware that the biological cost of their greenery is being pumped right back into the waters outside their bedroom windows. To see the real damage, we need to look at the physics of suffocation. When the brine leaves the discharge pipes, it possesses 3 distinct characteristics that make it lethal to marine life. First, it is significantly warmer than the surrounding seawater because of the industrial heat generated during the desalination process. Second, it often contains trace amounts of heavy metals, anti-scaling chemicals, and chlorine used to clean the machinery inside the plant. Third, and most importantly, it is incredibly dense. Because it contains up to twice the salt concentration of normal seawater, it is physically heavier than the water around it. When this hot, toxic, heavy liquid enters the ocean, it does not float. It sinks like a stone. It drops straight to the bottom of the sea, spreading out across the ocean floor like a thick, invisible carpet. This creates a terrifying physical phenomenon known in oceanography as a halocline. A halocline is a sharp boundary layer between waters of different salinity. The brine is so heavy that it refuses to mix with the lighter, normal seawater above it. It forms a distinct, inescapable barrier. If you were to drop a thermal camera into these waters, you would not see a uniform blue ocean. You would see violent ribbons of red and yellow thermal energy pooling at the bottom, crawling along the sand, filling every depression and trench. This bottom layer becomes a death zone. Because the halocline barrier is so strong, oxygen from the surface cannot penetrate the dense brine. The water trapped at the bottom is entirely cut off from the atmosphere. Any marine life that cannot swim away, such as corals, sponges, seagrasses, and bottom-dwelling organisms, is suddenly engulfed in a hot, chemical-rich, oxygen-starved fog. They simply suffocate. The seabed, which should be the foundational layer of the marine food web, turns into a barren wasteland. The sand is essentially sterilized. The intricate web of life that sustains a healthy coastal environment is shattered by a fundamental difference in fluid density. The physics are absolute. You cannot negotiate with gravity, and you cannot argue with the molecular weight of sodium chloride. The brine sinks, the oxygen disappears, and the ecosystem dies in silence. If the dense brine were the only problem, it would be bad enough. But the engineers who designed the Palm Jumeirah accidentally created the perfect trap to ensure this toxic water never leaves. To protect the delicate sand fronds of the artificial island from the erosive power of winter storms and ocean waves, the developers built a massive breakwater. This is known as the Crescent. It is a stunning arc of rock stretching 11 kilometers around the outer edge of the palm. From an architectural standpoint, It is a triumph of defensive engineering. It absorbs the kinetic energy of the sea, keeping the multi-million-dollar villas safe from erosion. But from a hydrodynamic standpoint, it is a catastrophic flaw. By entirely blocking the waves, the Crescent also blocks the natural ocean currents. In a normal coastal ecosystem, the tide acts like a massive set of lungs. Water flows in, oxygenates the bays, and then flushes out, carrying away waste, excess heat, and sediment. This natural flushing system is what keeps coastal waters clear and alive. But the Crescent effectively paralyzed the ocean. The intricate channels between the fronds of the palm became stagnant pools. The natural flow of water was reduced to a trickle. When the heavy, oxygen-starved brine seeps into these channels, it has nowhere to go. It is trapped inside an 11-kilometer prison wall. But the situation gets even worse. The Persian Gulf experiences some of the highest temperatures on Earth. During the brutal summer months, the shallow, stagnant water trapped inside the palm acts exactly like a giant solar oven. The relentless Arabian sun beats down on the trapped water, causing massive amounts of evaporation. As the pure water turns into vapor and escapes into the sky, it leaves all its salt behind. This means the stagnant water inside the breakwater is constantly becoming saltier and heavier just from the weather alone. You have an external machine pumping hyper-saline brine into the sea, and a localized climate engine evaporating the surface water to create even more salt. The very design that makes the Palm Jumeirah an exclusive, calm paradise for human beings has turned it into a stagnant, compounding poison bowl for marine life. The perfect architecture has engineered a perfect ecological trap. When water stops moving and oxygen levels crash, nature does not simply remain empty. It replaces complex life with something much more primitive and far more unpleasant. As the halocline settles and the bottom of the Palm Jumeirah runs out of oxygen, a condition known as hypoxia takes over. In this suffocating environment, normal marine animals perish. But a specific type of microorganism begins to thrive. These are anaerobic bacteria. They do not need oxygen to survive. Instead, they feast on the decaying organic matter that drops from the surface, the dead fish, the rotting seaweed, and the organic waste generated by the thousands of residents living on the island above. As these microscopic organisms consume the decay, they release a byproduct of their own, hydrogen sulfide gas. If you are not familiar with the chemical name, you are certainly familiar with its scent. Hydrogen sulfide is the exact chemical responsible for the overwhelming stench of rotting eggs. Slowly, silently, this gas bubbles up from the oxygen-starved seabed, rising through the water column and releasing itself into the hot desert air. The irony is almost too painful to articulate. Some of the wealthiest individuals in the global economy have paid tens of millions of dollars for waterfront properties only to step out onto their marble balconies and be greeted by the unmistakable smell of biological decomposition. But the chemical reactions do not stop at bad odors. The warm, stagnant, nutrient-rich waters trapped inside the Crescent create the absolute perfect breeding ground for toxic algal blooms. Without currents to disperse them, microscopic algae reproduce at terrifying speeds. The water, once marketed as a pristine turquoise blue, can suddenly transform into a murky, impenetrable green soup. These blooms block out the sunlight, further killing any remaining marine plant life below. When the algae eventually die, their decomposition sucks whatever microscopic traces of oxygen are left in the water, reinforcing the vicious cycle. The ecosystem is completely inverted. Instead of a vibrant coral reef, the developers have inadvertently engineered a massive, shallow bioreactor optimized for generating algae and swamp gas. The brochure promised a slice of ocean paradise. The reality is a highly active, chemically unstable zone of ecological decay, happening right in the backyards of the global elite. Faced with the undeniable decay of their signature asset, The operators of the Palm Jumeirah have been forced to intervene. You cannot sell waterfront luxury if the water looks like a swamp and smells like a sewer. But fixing a thermodynamic failure is incredibly expensive. In a desperate attempt to restore water circulation, the developers took heavy machinery and physically smashed gaps into the 11-kilometer Crescent breakwater they had spent millions to build. They hoped that cutting these artificial channels would allow the ocean tide to push fresh water back into the stagnant fronds. It was a partial fix, but it was not enough. The geometry of the fronds is too complex, and the brine is simply too heavy to be moved by gentle tidal action alone. So, they had to go further. Today, hidden beneath the surface of the water, massive mechanical aerators and industrial pumps run constantly. These machines are essentially giant underwater fans, desperately trying to churn the water, break the halocline, and force oxygen down to the dying seabed. It is an artificial life support system for an ocean. And this introduces the most terrifying concept for any investor: maintenance debt. These underwater machines consume massive amounts of electricity. They require constant maintenance in a highly corrosive saltwater environment. They are loud, they are expensive, and they can never ever be turned off. If the pumps stop, the water dies again. This creates a perpetual, compounding financial liability. Who pays the electricity bill for the ocean? The property owners do, through ever-increasing service charges. But real estate economics rely entirely on confidence and aesthetic perfection. If the maintenance fees skyrocket simply to keep the water from smelling like sulfur, the fundamental value of the asset begins to erode. No investor wants to buy into a project that is actively fighting a losing war against its own environment. The Palm Jumeirah was supposed to be a self-sustaining beacon of wealth. Instead, it has become a fragile mechanical patient, permanently tethered to an expensive network of pumps and aerators just to maintain the illusion of health. It is a spectacular economic trap. The developers built an asset so artificial that it requires a massive, invisible budget just to prevent it from decaying into an uninhabitable swamp. The crisis at the Palm Jumeirah is not an isolated incident. It is a localized symptom of a much larger, systemic vulnerability facing the entire macroeconomic model of Dubai. The city is caught in a brutal, inescapable loop dictated by the laws of thermodynamics. To grow the economy, the city needs more tourists, more residents, and more mega projects. But every new resident, every new hotel room, and every new golf course requires more fresh water. That demand forces the desalination plants to work harder, burning more fossil fuels and producing exponentially more toxic brine. That brine is then pumped back into the shallow Gulf, raising the salinity and the temperature of the very water the city relies on for its tourism appeal. As the coastal waters become hotter, saltier, and more hostile to life, the real estate built on those waters loses its intrinsic value. To artificially maintain that value, the city must spend astronomical amounts of capital on mechanical intervention, like smashing breakwaters and running underwater aerators. This capital expenditure drains resources that could be used for actual economic growth. It is an economic Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail. The city is leveraging its financial future to fight a war against the physical limits of its own geography. You can manipulate tax codes, you can manipulate marketing campaigns, and you can manipulate real estate prices. But you cannot manipulate the density of salt water. You cannot bribe anaerobic bacteria. And you cannot negotiate with the heat capacity of the ocean. The brilliant engineers of Dubai have managed to build a dazzling empire on the sand. But they are now discovering that while human beings might forget the environmental costs of endless expansion, nature always keeps a flawless accounting ledger. The bill for the Palm Jumeirah is being presented not in dollars, but in dead water, rising maintenance debts, and a slow, irreversible shift in the chemical balance of the sea. The illusion of infinite growth is finally colliding with the hard, unforgiving reality of physics. The story of the hyper-saline water suffocating the Palm Jumeirah is a perfect microcosm for the hidden vulnerabilities of extreme urban development. It reveals a fundamental truth about attempting to master nature for the sake of luxury real estate. Engineering can certainly delay the consequences of a bad design, but it can never cancel them entirely. The creators of this artificial paradise successfully conquered the ocean for a brief moment in time, creating billions in temporary value. But the ocean is now reclaiming its territory, not through dramatic floods or tidal waves, but through the slow, invisible, and suffocating weight of heavy salt and depleted oxygen. The very wealth that built the island is now being drained just to keep the water breathing. It is a testament to human ambition, but it is also a permanent warning. When you build a machine designed to ignore the laws of the natural world, you will eventually spend all your energy just trying to stop that machine from tearing itself apart. If you value documentaries that look beyond the skyline and investigate the hidden mechanics of our modern world, make sure to subscribe. The next warning sign is rarely where the brochure tells you to look. This video is an independent analysis based on publicly available data, environmental science principles, and oceanographic research at the time of production. Economic and ecological conditions are subject to change. This content explores systemic urban planning and environmental mechanisms and is not intended to target or criticize any specific residents, communities, or nationalities. The information provided does not constitute financial, real estate, or travel advice. Certain conclusions are analytical inferences drawn from the physical and thermodynamic realities discussed.